Poor little girl gives her last piece of bread to a paralyzed beggar, unaware he was a disguised millionaire. The next day, a luxury car shows up in front of her house. Before the story begins, wherever life has placed you today, this message is for you. The autumn wind cut through downtown Portland like a knife, carrying the scent of rain and broken dreams. 8-year-old Emma Thompson clutched the paper bag containing her school lunch, a single peanut butter sandwich and an apple her mother, Dorothy, had carefully packed before rushing off to her morning cleaning job. Emma's stomach growled as she walked past the sleeping figures huddled in doorways. Her worn sneakers, held together with duct tape, splashed through shallow puddles as she made her way toward Lincoln Elementary. The sandwich in her bag represented more than food. It was Dorothy's sacrifice, made from the last groceries bought. With tip money from the diner halfway to school, Emma noticed him, an elderly man in a wheelchair, positioned against the brick wall of Murphy's hardware store. His clothes were tattered, his gray beard unkempt, and his weathered hands shook slightly as he held a cardboard sign reading "Hungry, God bless." Something deep inside Emma's chest tightened. She recognized the hollow look in his eyes, the same expression she'd seen in her mother's face when Dorothy thought no one was watching. The man's lips moved silently, as if praying, and Emma noticed how his thin frame seemed to disappear into the oversized coat wrapped around him. Without hesitation, Emma approached the stranger. "Sir," she said softly, her small voice barely audible above the morning traffic. The man looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. For a moment something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps even recognition of something familiar. "Are you hungry?" Emma asked, already reaching into her bag. The man nodded slowly. "Very hungry, little angel." Emma pulled out her sandwich, carefully unwrapped from the plastic bag Dorothy had saved and reused countless times. The peanut butter had been spread thin to make it last, but it was made with love. "Here," she said, extending the sandwich toward him. "It's all I have, but Mama says sharing what we have makes us rich in ways that matter." The man's hands trembled as he accepted the food. "Child, this is your lunch. You'll be hungry at school." Emma shrugged, her innocent smile brightening. "The gray morning, I can wait until dinner. You look like you can't." As the elderly man bit into the sandwich, tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. He chewed slowly, savoring each bite as if it were the finest meal he'd ever tasted. "What's your name, little one?" he asked between bites. "Emma Thompson. I live on Maple Street with my mama. She works real hard, but she always tells me to help others when we can." The man studied her carefully, memorizing every detail of her kind face. "Emma Thompson," he repeated softly. "That's a beautiful name for a beautiful soul." Emma smiled, and glanced at the school clock visible through the hardware store window. "I have to go now or I'll be late, but I hope you feel better, sir." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back. "My mama says tomorrow always brings new chances. I hope tomorrow brings you something wonderful." As Emma disappeared around the corner, the man in the wheelchair finished the last bite of her sandwich. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an expensive smartphone, his fingers moving with practiced precision despite their earlier trembling. "Marcus," he said when the call connected. "It's time. I've found her." Dorothy Thompson arrived home at 6:47 p.m., her second shift at Murphy's diner finally over. Her feet ached in the worn waitress shoes she'd been meaning to replace for months, and her uniform carried the lingering sense of bacon grease and disappointment. The tip jar had been light again today, barely enough to cover Emma's school supplies for next week. Emma was sitting at their small kitchen table, carefully coloring a worksheet by the dim light of their single functioning lamp. She looked up as Dorothy entered, her face immediately brightening with that radiant smile that made every exhausting day worthwhile. "Mama, how was work?" Emma asked, setting down her crayon. "Fine, baby girl. How was school? Did you eat your lunch?" Dorothy asked, hanging her coat on the hook by the door, and noting how Emma had already started her homework without being asked. Emma hesitated for just a moment. "School was good. Mrs. Patterson says I'm reading at a 5th grade level now." Dorothy's heart swelled with pride, even as she noticed Emma hadn't answered the lunch question. She was about to probe further when a sound outside made them both freeze, the unmistakable purr of an expensive engine pulling up to their modest duplex. Through their thin curtains, they could see the sleek silhouette of a black Mercedes-Benz, its chrome gleaming under the streetlight. The engine shut off, and the sudden silence felt almost oppressive. "Mama," Emma whispered, instinctively moving closer to Dorothy's side. Dorothy wrapped a protective arm around her daughter, her mind racing through possibilities. Bill collectors drove beat-up sedans, not luxury cars. The landlord had already come by this month, and they didn't know anyone who could afford a vehicle worth more than their annual rent. The car doors remained closed, but they could see the silhouette of at least 2 people inside. The driver appeared to be speaking on a phone, gesturing occasionally toward their house. "Who do you think it is?" Emma asked, her 80-year-old curiosity overriding her caution. Dorothy's protective instincts kicked into high gear. Living paycheck to paycheck in their neighborhood had taught her that unexpected visitors in expensive cars usually brought trouble. Repo men, investigators, or worse, people who might question her ability to care for Emma. "I don't know, sweetheart," but we're going to stay inside and see what they want," Dorothy said, moving them both away from the window while keeping her eyes on the car. Minutes ticked by. The Mercedes remained parked outside, its occupants apparently in no hurry. Dorothy's anxiety grew with each passing moment. She thought about the overdue electric bill hidden in her purse, the rent that would be late again next week, and the growing list of things Emma needed that Dorothy couldn't provide. "Maybe they're just lost," Emma suggested hopefully, though her voice carried a tremor that revealed her own unease. Dorothy hugged her daughter tighter. In their world, black Mercedes didn't get lost in neighborhoods like theirs. They came looking for something specific, and Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that whatever brought them here would change everything. The passenger door finally opened, and an impeccably dressed man in his 40s stepped out, straightening his tie as he surveyed their modest street. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Dorothy made in 3 months. "Stay here, Emma," Dorothy whispered, her heart pounding as she watched the stranger approach their front door. The knock came in 3 measured raps, neither aggressive nor apologetic, the sound of someone conducting business. Dorothy's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the deadbolt, Emma peering around her mother's legs despite being told to stay back. Dorothy opened the door just wide enough to see the visitor, keeping the chain lock engaged. The man on her doorstep looked like he'd stepped from the pages of a business magazine. Tailored navy suit, polished leather shoes, and an expensive watch that caught the porch light. "Mrs. Thompson." His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms and negotiations. "My name is Marcus Whitmore. I represent a private foundation focused on community outreach. I was hoping we could speak about your daughter, Emma." Dorothy's blood ran cold. Social services had already visited twice since David's death 3 years ago, both times triggered by well-meaning school counselors concerned about Emma's sometimes empty lunchboxes or worn clothing. Each visit had been a nightmare of invasive questions and thinly veiled threats about Emma's welfare. "Emma's fine," Dorothy said quickly, instinctively stepping protectively in front of her daughter. "We don't need any services, and I haven't applied for anything." Marcus raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, seeming to recognize her fear. "Mrs. Thompson, this isn't about social services. This is about something wonderful your daughter did today. May I come in? I think you'll want to hear the story." Emma tugged on her mother's shirt. "Mama, it's okay. I think I know what this is about." Dorothy looked down at her daughter in surprise. "You do?" Before Emma could answer, Marcus continued. "Your daughter performed an extraordinary act of kindness today. She gave her lunch to someone who really needed it, without knowing anything about him except that he was hungry." The pieces began clicking together in Dorothy's mind. Emma's earlier evasiveness about lunch, her absence of complaints about being hungry, and now this mysterious visitor mentioning her daughter's generosity. "The man she helped," Marcus continued, "would very much like to thank her properly. He's actually waiting in the car, hoping you might allow him to meet you both." Dorothy's protective instincts warred with curiosity. "Who is he? And why does helping a homeless person require a Mercedes and a man in a $1,000 suit?" Marcus smiled at her astute observation. "Because the man your daughter helped isn't homeless, Mrs. Thompson. His name is Harold Whitmore, and he's one of the most successful businessmen on the West Coast. He was conducting what you might call a personal experiment when Emma found him." Emma's eyes widened. The man in the wheelchair wasn't really homeless. "Oh, he was genuinely hungry and genuinely in need," Marcus assured her quickly, "but he was testing something about human nature, about who would help a stranger with nothing to gain in return. Your daughter passed that test with flying colors." Dorothy remained skeptical. "And now what? He wants to write a check and feel good about himself." Marcus's expression grew more serious. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, he wants to offer you something much more significant than a check. But I think that conversation would be better coming from him directly. Would you be willing to step outside and meet him? I promise you, this could change your lives in ways you can't imagine." Emma looked up at her mother with bright, hopeful eyes. "Can we, Mama? I want to see if he's okay." Dorothy found herself caught between suspicion and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, something good was finally happening to them. Harold Whitmore sat in his wheelchair beside the Mercedes, having insisted Marcus help him out of the car despite the evening chill. At 72, he'd learned that important conversations required eye-level honesty, not the artificial advantage of looking down from a car seat. As Dorothy and Emma approached, Harold's weathered face broke into a genuine smile, the same expression Emma had seen briefly that morning, though now without the careful mask of desperate need he'd worn earlier. "Emma," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I wanted to thank you properly for your gift today." Emma shook his hand solemnly, studying his face with the intense curiosity only children possess. "You look different. Are you feeling better?" Harold chuckled, a rich sound that carried years of hard-earned wisdom. "Much better, thanks to you. And you're right, I do look different. When we meet people in their moment of greatest need, we show them our truest selves. This morning I was genuinely hungry and genuinely grateful." Dorothy remained positioned protectively near Emma, her arms crossed. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your gratitude, but Emma was just doing what any decent person should do. She doesn't need a reward for basic human kindness. You're absolutely right, Harold agreed, surprising her. Kindness should never require a reward. But sometimes kindness reveals something so extraordinary that ignoring it would be the real mistake. He gestured toward the modest neighborhood around them. Mrs. Thompson, I've spent the last 6 months visiting different communities, observing how people treat those they perceive as having nothing to offer them. In dozens of interactions, your daughter is the first person to give away her only food without hesitation. Lots of people are kind to the homeless, Dorothy said defensively. Spare change, yes, leftover food. Sometimes, but Emma gave me her entire lunch, knowing she'd go hungry. That's not ordinary kindness. That's character that can't be taught or faked. Harold paused, his pale blue eyes growing distant. 40 years ago, I was 8 years old and living in a car with my mother in Detroit. A little girl named Susan Patterson gave me her sandwich one day. That moment changed my life's trajectory, Emma gasped. What happened to her? I spent 20 years trying to find her to say thank you. By the time I did, Susan had died in a car accident. I never got to tell her how that one sandwich gave me hope when I had none, how it inspired me to believe people could be genuinely good. Harold's voice grew thick with emotion. I've been successful in business, Emma, very successful, but I've never stopped looking for another Susan Patterson, someone whose heart is so pure they give without calculating the cost. Dorothy felt her defenses beginning to weaken despite herself. Mr. Whitmore, what exactly are you proposing? I'd like to establish a trust fund for Emma's education. Full ride to any college she chooses, plus living expenses. I'd also like to help with some immediate needs, clearing your debts, ensuring you have reliable transportation, making sure Emma never has to choose between her lunch and helping someone again. The offer hung in the air like a dream too good to be true. Dorothy's practical mind immediately began searching for the catch, the hidden strings that would make this generosity costly in unexpected ways. Why? She asked simply. Harold smiled. Because 40 years later I finally found my Susan Patterson. And this time I'm going to make sure she knows how much her kindness matters. Dorothy's hands shook as she gripped Emma's shoulders, the magnitude of Harold's offer crashing over her like a tidal wave. College tuition, debt relief, reliable transportation, things she'd dreamed about but never dared hope for. Yet every survival instinct she'd developed since David's death screamed warnings about offers too good to be true. I need to think about this, Dorothy said, her voice barely steady. Emma, say thank you to Mr. Whitmore, then go inside and finish your homework. Emma looked between the adults, sensing the tension she couldn't fully understand. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I hope I see you again. Harold's face softened. I hope so too, little angel. After Emma reluctantly went inside, Dorothy turned back to Harold with steel in her voice. What do you really want? Nobody gives away hundreds of thousands of dollars because a kid shared a sandwich. There has to be something else. Harold exchanged a glance with Marcus before answering. You're right to be suspicious. Mrs. Thompson, you've had to protect Emma alone for 3 years. I understand your caution. Then understand this, Dorothy said firmly. I've worked 3 jobs to keep us independent. I've never taken handouts, never made Emma feel like we needed pity. We may not have much, but we have our dignity. Dignity, Harold repeated thoughtfully. Do you know what I learned living in that car with my mother? Dignity isn't about refusing help, it's about maintaining your values regardless of your circumstances. You've raised Emma to have the same character you have. That's worth more than money. Dorothy's resolve wavered slightly. If you're so successful, why dress up like a homeless person? Why the deception? Harold's expression grew somber. Because I needed to know if true kindness still existed. I've been surrounded by people who want something from me for so long, I'd forgotten what genuine goodness looked like. Marcus stepped forward. Mrs. Thompson, my father has been planning this project for 2 years. He's established a foundation specifically to identify and support families who demonstrate exceptional character. Emma isn't his first discovery, but she's definitely his most remarkable. I don't want Emma growing up thinking money solves everything, Dorothy said. I don't want her to lose the values that made her help you in the first place. Harold smiled sadly. Mrs. Thompson, I've spent 40 years trying to honor Susan Patterson's memory. I've donated millions to charities, funded scholarships, built hospitals, but nothing is felt as meaningful as that moment when an 8-year-old girl chose compassion over convenience. He paused, studying Dorothy's conflicted expression. I'm not asking you to change who you are or who Emma is. I'm asking you to let me ensure that her goodness is rewarded instead of punished by a world that often makes kindness costly. Dorothy looked toward their house, where Emma's silhouette was visible in the window, probably pretending to do homework, while trying to overhear their conversation. I need time, she said finally. This is overwhelming, of course, Harold agreed. Take all the time you need. But Mrs. Thompson, Emma's kindness has already changed my life, whether or not you accept my help. She's reminded me why I wanted to be successful in the first place. As the Mercedes pulled away, Dorothy stood alone on her porch, wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of their lives by not immediately accepting Harold's offer. 3 days passed with Dorothy barely sleeping, Harold's offer consuming her thoughts like a fever she couldn't break. She'd researched him extensively using the library's computers during Emma's school hours, discovering that Harold Whitmore wasn't just wealthy, he was legendarily so. His business empire, built from nothing, was valued in the hundreds of millions, yet every article she found confirmed the same thing. Harold was known for his philanthropy, his ethical business practices, and his almost obsessive privacy. No scandals, no lawsuits, no whispers of impropriety. If anything, he seemed too good to be true. Thursday evening brought another knock at their door. This time, Dorothy was expecting it. Harold sat alone on their porch steps, having apparently dismissed Marcus and arrived in a simple sedan rather than the intimidating Mercedes. He looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable without the expensive car and formal setting. "I thought maybe we could talk without the business theatrics," he said as Dorothy joined him on the steps. "Emma at school." "Art club," Dorothy replied, settling beside him but maintaining careful distance. "She's been asking about you every day." Harold smiled. "I've been thinking about her too, and about you." He turned to study Dorothy's profile. "You know, you remind me of my mother. She was about your age when we were living in that car. What happened to her? Cancer took her when I was 16, but she lived long enough to see me graduate high school with a full scholarship to Oregon State." Harold's voice grew quiet. "She never stopped believing things would get better, even when we were eating in soup kitchens." Dorothy felt something shift inside her chest. "You really were poor, devastatingly poor. The kind of poor where you count out crackers to make them last, where you wear the same clothes until they fall apart, where you lie awake at night listening to your mother cry and pretend you can't hear." The raw honesty in his voice broke through Dorothy's remaining defenses. "How did you go from living in a car to this?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. "After my mother died, I lived with my uncle. He owned a small construction company and taught me about hard work and integrity. I saved every penny, put myself through college, started my own business." He paused. "But none of that matters as much as what your daughter reminded me of, which is that success means nothing if it doesn't serve something bigger than yourself. I've spent 40 years building wealth, Mrs. Thompson, but Emma reminded me that the most valuable currency isn't money, it's the ability to choose. Kindness when kindness costs you something." Dorothy felt tears threatening. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Scared that accepting your help means Emma will grow up thinking life should be easy. Scared that we'll become dependent on something that could disappear." Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "These are the legal documents establishing Emma's educational trust. It's irrevocable. Nobody can take it away, not even me. The principal is protected, managed by independent trustees. It's not charity, Dorothy, it's a permanent recognition of character." Dorothy stared at the envelope, knowing that accepting it would change everything. "But," Harold continued, "there's something else I need to tell you, something that might change how you feel about this offer." He looked directly into her eyes, and Dorothy saw something there that made her breath catch, a deep sadness that seemed to echo with decades of pain. "The truth is, Mrs. Thompson, I need this as much as Emma does, maybe more." Harold's words hung in the evening air like a confession waiting to be born. Dorothy searched his weathered face, seeing past the expensive clothes and successful exterior to something broken underneath. "What do you mean you need this?" she asked softly. Harold was quiet for so long that Dorothy wondered if he'd changed his mind about sharing whatever burden he carried. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled with barely contained emotion. "I had a granddaughter," he began, the past tense hitting Dorothy like a physical blow. "Her name was Sarah. She would have been 9 years old now." Dorothy's heart clenched. "Would have been leukemia took her 2 years ago. She fought for 18 months, through chemotherapy and bone marrow transplants and procedures that no child should ever endure." Harold's hands shook as he spoke. "But through it all, she never lost her kindness. Even when she was weak and sick, she'd give her hospital toys to other children." Tears began streaming down Harold's cheeks, and Dorothy found herself reaching, instinctively to touch his arm. "The day before she died, Sarah made me promise something. She said, 'Grandpa, when I'm gone, find another little girl who needs help and love her like you loved me.'" Harold's voice broke completely. "I've been looking for 2 years, Dorothy. I visited schools, hospitals, community centers, but none of them had what Sarah had, which was pure goodness, the kind that gives without thinking about the cost. When Emma handed me that sandwich, it was like Sarah was speaking through her." Harold wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't want to replace Sarah, nobody could. But Emma has reminded me that Sarah's spirit lives on in other children who choose kindness over everything else." Dorothy felt her own tears starting. "Harold, I'm so sorry. My son Marcus, he tries to understand, but he thinks I'm being sentimental. He says I should honor Sarah's memory by donating to children's hospitals or cancer research, and I do those things. But Sarah didn't ask me to write checks. She asked me to love another little girl." The weight of Harold's grief settled between them like a living thing. Dorothy understood now why this mattered so much to him, why the offer felt less like charity and more like salvation for both families. Is that why you were testing people, looking for someone like Sarah? Harold nodded. I needed to know if genuine goodness still existed in children, or if the world had become too cynical, too selfish. Emma proved it does exist. Dorothy looked toward their house, where Emma was probably peeking through the curtains, trying to figure out why her mother was crying on the porch with the man from the wheelchair. She's not Sarah, Dorothy said gently. No, Harold agreed. She's Emma, and that's exactly who I need her to be. A comfortable silence settled between them as they both processed the emotional revelation. Dorothy felt the last of her resistance crumbling, not because of the money Harold offered, but because of the healing they both desperately needed. If we do this, Dorothy said finally, if we accept your help, what does that look like? I won't have Emma feeling obligated to you, or thinking she needs to be someone she's not. Harold's face brightened with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It looks like family, Dorothy, the kind Sarah would have wanted me to find. The next morning brought Marcus Whitmore to their door at precisely 8 a.m. carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Dorothy had expected this meeting. Harold had warned her that his son had reservations about the arrangement. Mrs. Thompson, Marcus said with professional courtesy that felt practiced rather than genuine. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to discuss some practical matters regarding my father's proposal. Dorothy invited him in, noting how his eyes swept their modest living room with barely concealed judgment. Emma had already left for school, giving them privacy for what Dorothy suspected would be a difficult conversation. Coffee, Dorothy offered, though they both knew it was instant coffee served in mismatched mugs. No, thank you. Marcus settled uncomfortably on their second-hand couch, his expensive suit looking out of place against the worn fabric. Mrs. Thompson, I need to be direct with you. I'm concerned about my father's emotional state. Dorothy's defenses immediately went up. He seemed perfectly lucid to me. Lucid, yes, but he's been different since Sarah died. This project of his, testing strangers, looking for another child to help his therapist, thinks it's an unhealthy way of processing grief. And you agree? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I think my father is a brilliant businessman who's making emotional decisions, establishing a trust fund for a child he met once, based on a single act of kindness. It's not rational. Dorothy stood and moved to the window, needing distance from Marcus's cold analysis. What would be rational? Ignoring a child's character because it doesn't fit a business model? I'm not suggesting that. But my father has a pattern of grand gestures when he's grieving. After Sarah's diagnosis, he donated $50 million to children's hospitals. After she died, he funded an entire research wing. Now those sound like wonderful things, they are, but they're also ways of avoiding the actual work of grieving. Marcus pulled documents from his portfolio. Mrs. Thompson, I've prepared an alternative proposal. A one-time payment of $50,000 for Emma's college fund, managed by you. No ongoing relationship, no complicated trust arrangements. Dorothy turned from the window to study Marcus's face. She saw fear there, not of her or Emma, but of watching his father get hurt again. You think we'll disappoint him? Marcus had the grace to look ashamed. I think he's projecting Sarah onto your daughter. What happens when Emma grows up and becomes her own person? What happens when she makes mistakes or chooses paths my father doesn't approve of? What happened when Sarah made mistakes? She was too young to make real mistakes. She was perfect because she was dying. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. The father has idealized her memory to the point where no living child could compete. Dorothy sat back down, seeing Marcus clearly for the first time. You're not protecting me and Emma from Harold. You're protecting Harold from the disappointment of real human relationships. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Maybe both. Your father loved Sarah exactly as she was, sick, fighting, scared, but still kind. He doesn't need Emma to be perfect. He needs her to be real, and when real gets complicated. Dorothy smiled sadly. Then we figure it out together. That's what families do. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, then slowly put his documents back in his portfolio. My father said you reminded him of his mother. I'm beginning to see why. 2 weeks later, Dorothy stood in the parking lot of Pacific Northwest Bank, clutching the keys to a 3-year-old Honda Civic, reliable, safe, and completely paid for. Harold had insisted on practical gifts rather than extravagant ones. Understanding that Dorothy needed to maintain her sense of independence, that trust fund for Emma's education had been established with ironclad legal protections. The house payments were current, and the crushing weight of overdue bills had been lifted from Dorothy's shoulders. For the first time in 3 years, she could breathe without counting every penny. But the most significant change wasn't financial, it was the regular presence of Harold in their lives. 3 evenings a week he joined them for dinner, sharing stories of his own childhood and listening intently to Emma's school adventures. He never tried to replace David's memory, but gradually carved out his own space in their small family. Emma had blossomed under Harold's attention. Her confidence grew as she realized that her natural kindness was valued and celebrated rather than taken for granted. She'd started a kindness club at school, encouraging other children to look for ways to help their classmates. This evening, as Dorothy prepared spaghetti with meat sauce, a luxury they could now afford regularly, she watched Harold and Emma working on a jigsaw puzzle at the kitchen table. The sight filled her with warmth and something she was afraid to name: hope for a future beyond mere survival. "Harold," Emma said suddenly, looking up from the puzzle pieces, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. Why didn't you have any more grandchildren after Sarah?" The question hung in the air like a delicate soap bubble, beautiful and fragile. Dorothy froze at the stove, her hands gripping the wooden spoon as she waited for Harold's response. Harold set down his puzzle piece and gave Emma his full attention. "Sarah was my only grandchild. Her daddy, my son Marcus, never got married or had children. Why not?" Harold glanced at Dorothy, seeking permission to continue this difficult conversation. She nodded slightly, trusting his judgment. "Sometimes, Emma, people get so focused on work and success that they forget about the things that really matter. Marcus has been taking care of business since he was young, and I think he forgot to take care of his heart." Emma considered this, with the serious expression she wore when processing complex emotions. "Is he lonely?" "I think he might be, yes. Maybe we could help him not be lonely anymore." Harold's eyes filled with tears at Emma's instinctive desire to fix the pain she sensed around her. "How would we do that, little angel?" "We could invite him for dinner. Mama makes really good spaghetti, and lonely people probably don't eat good food very much." Dorothy felt her heart swell with pride at her daughter's wisdom. "Would you like that, Harold? Having Marcus join us sometime?" Harold looked between Dorothy and Emma, seeing the family he'd never dared hope for expanding to include. The son he'd been slowly losing to his own grief and guilt. "I think that's the most wonderful idea anyone's had in a very long time." As if summoned by their conversation, Harold's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and frowned. "What is it?" Dorothy asked, noticing his expression change. Harold's face had gone pale. "It's Marcus. He says there's something important he needs to tell us. Something about Sarah." Marcus arrived an hour later, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. His usually perfect hair was mussed. His tie loosened, and his hand shook slightly as he accepted Dorothy's offer of coffee. Emma had been sent to her room to finish homework, sensing the adult conversation that was about to unfold. "Dad," Marcus began, his voice strained. "There's something I should have told you 2 years ago. Something about Sarah's last day." Harold's face went rigid. "What about it?" Marcus took a shuddering breath. "You remember how you left the hospital that evening to get dinner? You'd been there for 36 hours straight, and the nurses insisted you take a break. I remember when I came back, Sarah was—" Harold couldn't finish the sentence. "She was awake when I arrived. The doctors said she probably wouldn't regain consciousness, but she did. For about 20 minutes, Marcus's voice cracked. "She knew she was dying, Dad, and she asked me to give you a message." Harold gripped the edge of the kitchen table so hard his knuckles turned white. "What message?" "She said to tell you that she'd already found the little girl you should help. She said her name was Emma Thompson, and that you'd know her because she would give away her lunch to feed someone hungry." The words hit the room like a physical force. Dorothy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Harold stared at his son in disbelief. "That's impossible," Harold whispered. "I met Emma 3 weeks ago. Sarah died 2 years ago." Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know how it sounds. I convinced myself Sarah was hallucinating, that it was just random words from a dying child's confused mind. That's why I didn't tell you." "But," Dorothy prompted, sensing there was more. "But when you told me about finding Emma, when you described what happened, everything Sarah said was exactly right. The name, the lunch, even the fact that she'd be someone who gives without thinking about the cost." Harold rose unsteadily from his chair, pacing to the window as he struggled to process this revelation. "You're saying Sarah somehow knew about Emma 2 years before I met her?" "I'm saying that's what she told me, and Dad, there's more." Harold turned back, his face pale. More. Marcus pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Sarah wrote something while you were gone. The nurses helped her hold the pen. She made me promise to give this to you, but only after you'd found Emma." With trembling hands, Harold unfolded the paper. Sarah's shaky 8-year-old handwriting spelled out words that made him sink back into his chair. "Grandpa, Emma will need a family when her daddy goes to heaven. He will need a granddaughter when I go to heaven. God makes sure people who love each other find each other. Take care of Emma and her mommy. Love, Sarah." Dorothy felt the world tilt around her. Sarah knew about David. How could she possibly know about David? Marcus shook his head. "I don't understand it either. But Sarah always seemed to know things she shouldn't. The doctors called it intuition, but it was more than that." Harold stared at the note, his hands shaking. "David died 3 years ago. Sarah wrote this 2 years ago, 1 year after he was already gone." The implications hung heavy in the room. Either they were witnessing something impossible, or Sarah's final gift to her grandfather was far more miraculous than any of them had imagined. "What do we do with this?" Dorothy asked softly. Harold looked at her with wonder and gratitude. "We honor it. We become the family Sarah knew we were meant to be. In the weeks following Marcus's revelation, their unconventional family began to truly solidify. Marcus started joining their Sunday dinners, gradually shedding his corporate armor and rediscovering the son Harold had feared was lost to ambition and grief. Emma had taken to Marcus immediately, sensing his underlying kindness beneath the businessman's exterior. She'd appointed herself his teacher in fun things, introducing him to board games, cartoon movies, and the simple pleasure of building blanket forts in the living room. Dorothy watched this transformation with amazement and growing affection. Marcus's laughter, when it finally emerged, was rusty from disuse but genuine. She began to understand why Harold worried about his son's loneliness. Marcus had spent so many years protecting himself from emotional pain that he'd forgotten how to experience emotional joy. This Sunday evening, as they cleaned up from dinner, Emma made an announcement that stopped everyone in their tracks. "I want to visit Sarah," she said simply, setting down her dish towel. The adults exchanged glances. They'd talked about Sarah often, sharing memories and stories, but visiting her grave hadn't been discussed. "Why, sweetheart?" Dorothy asked gently. Emma's expression was serious beyond her 8 years. "Because I want to thank her and I want to tell her that we're taking good care of Grandpa Harold and Uncle Marcus." Harold's breath caught at hearing himself called Grandpa for the first time since Sarah's death. Marcus blinked back tears at the unexpected title of uncle. "Are you sure that's what you want?" Harold asked, kneeling to Emma's eye level. Emma nodded firmly. "Sarah helped us find each other. I think she should know it worked." The next Saturday they drove together to Riverside Memorial Gardens. Sarah's grave was marked with a simple granite stone adorned with fresh flowers. Harold's weekly ritual of remembrance. Emma approached the headstone with the solemnity of someone far older, carrying a handful of dandelions she'd picked from their yard. She knelt and placed them carefully beside Harold's roses. "Hi, Sarah," she began, her young voice clear in the cemetery quiet. "My name is Emma Thompson. I think you already know about me." Harold wiped his eyes as Emma continued her one-sided conversation with the granddaughter who had somehow orchestrated their meeting from beyond the grave. "I wanted you to know that your grandpa isn't sad all the time anymore. He smiles when we do puzzles and he laughs when I tell him jokes. Uncle Marcus is learning to have fun too. Mama says he needed a family as much as we did." Emma paused, studying the headstone thoughtfully. "I wish I could have met you. Grandpa Harold says you were really kind, like me. I think we would have been friends." She stood and took Harold's hand. "I promise to take good care of them, okay? Just like you wanted." As they walked back to the car, Marcus spoke quietly to his father. "She really believes Sarah led us to her, doesn't she?" Harold smiled through his tears. "Don't you?" Marcus considered, watching Emma skip ahead with Dorothy. 2 months ago, he would have dismissed such thinking as grief-induced fantasy. Now, having witnessed the profound healing that had occurred in all their lives, he found himself open to possibilities beyond logical explanation. "Maybe I do," he admitted. "Maybe some things are more important than understanding how they happen." Harold squeezed his son's shoulder. "Sarah would be proud of the man you're becoming." "I hope so. I hope she'd be proud of all of us." As they reached the car, Emma turned back toward Sarah's grave one more time. "Thank you," she whispered too quietly for the adults to hear. "Thank you for giving me a grandfather." 1 year later, Emma stood at the podium in the Portland Community Center, her voice clear and confident as she addressed an audience of 200 people gathered for the first annual Sarah Whitmore Kindness Awards. "My name is Emma Thompson, and I want to tell you about the day that changed my life forever," she began, her words carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned that small acts of love can create miracles. In the audience, Dorothy watched with pride as her 9-year-old daughter spoke about the sandwich that had led to so much more than any of them could have imagined. Harold sat beside her, tears streaming down his face as Emma honored Sarah's memory by celebrating the kindness they'd found in each other. Marcus had spearheaded the foundation's establishment, channeling his business skills into creating a lasting tribute to his niece's legacy. The Sarah Whitmore Kindness Awards would recognize children who demonstrated exceptional compassion, providing educational support and celebrating character over achievement. "The man I gave my lunch to wasn't really homeless," Emma continued, "but he was hungry for proof that good people still existed. And I wasn't really giving away food, I was giving away love. That's what kindness really is, love in action." As Emma spoke about the importance of choosing compassion even when it costs us something, Dorothy reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. They'd started as 2 people struggling to survive and had somehow become part of something larger, a family bound not by blood but by shared values and mutual care. Harold had kept his promise to honor Sarah's memory by loving another little girl, but in the process, he'd gained so much more. Marcus had rediscovered his capacity for joy. Dorothy had found security in partnership, and Emma had learned that her natural kindness was a superpower that could change lives. Sarah Whitmore knew something the rest of us are still learning, Emma said, approaching the end of her speech. She knew that love doesn't end when someone dies, it just finds new ways to grow. When we choose kindness, we're not just helping one person. We're creating ripples that spread out and touch lives we'll never even know about. The audience rose in a standing ovation as Emma concluded her remarks. But the most meaningful applause came from the 3 people in the front row who had become her family through the simple act of sharing a sandwich with a stranger. After the ceremony, as they walked to the car together, Emma slipped her hand into Harold's. "Grandpa, Harold, do you think Sarah knows about tonight?" Harold squeezed her small hand gently. "I think Sarah planned tonight, sweetheart. I think she's been planning all of this since the beginning." Emma smiled and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. "I think so too, and I think she's proud of us." As they drove home together, Harold and Marcus in the front, Dorothy and Emma in the back, their conversation filled with plans for the Foundation's future and Emma's upcoming science fair project. None of them noticed the gentle breeze that rustled the trees despite the still night. Some might call it coincidence, others might call it impossible. But Emma Thompson, who had learned that the greatest miracles often begin with the smallest gestures of love, simply called it what it was: the continuing story of a little girl who gave away her lunch and received a family in return, guided by an angel who understood that kindness is the bridge between heaven and earth.